From Asia Society Switzerland, this is State of Asia. We're back with a new series of engaging conversations with leading minds on issues that shape Asia and that affect us all. My name is Nico Lochsinger. This year has really been a year of leadership change in Asia and many other places around the world. There have been several high-profile elections in Taiwan, in Pakistan, in Indonesia, in India, and in several other places. Then we had leaders who were forced out of office in Bangladesh by public anger, in Thailand by a court. The Japanese prime minister has announced that he would resign. Vietnam's party chairman has died in office. And meanwhile, in Europe, the UK has a new government, a new prime minister. The EU has a new commission, albeit with the same president. And of course, we're heading towards the US presidential elections, which will yield a new US president. So today, I want to talk about what some of these changes in Asia mean and how the incoming governments in the West should and could respond to it. And here to discuss with me is none other than James Crabtree, who of course is the Toy Senior Fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute and Asia Society Switzerland. He's also a Senior Fellow at the European Council for Foreign Relations, former Director of IISS Asia, author and journalist, and speaker at our upcoming flagship conference, State of Asia, on November 7 in Zurich. James, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, nice to be here.
So let's just start somewhere. Of all these changes in leadership that we've seen so far this year, which one do you believe has had or will have the most profound impact? And I'm excluding here the presidential elections in the US, which haven't happened yet, and I think which we can agree might probably be the most impactful of the others that we've seen in Asia. Which is the one that you believe will have the most lasting impact?
Well, I think you split apart the events very nicely in your introduction, Nico. So what you saw in the earlier elections this year, so Taiwan, India, Indonesia, some of the ones that people were really looking to at the beginning of the year, we didn't see too many surprises in the sense that everybody who was expected to win did win. But I think I would point to India as the one that is the most significant. I mean, it's the biggest country, the most important. And although Prime Minister Narendra Modi did win, the fact that he won by much less than was expected basically takes off the table to an important degree a future for India which a lot of people had feared, namely the gradual drift / the deliberate pushing of changing India's nature from a secular republic as it was founded in the middle of the last century to a much more religious ethnic democracy that it could have been by the middle of this century if Mr. Modi had been returned with another comparable third majority. Then I think it was pretty clear that his supporters were going to push forward towards that goal. So given India is 1.4 billion people, the most populous country in the world, and Asia's second rising superpower, the one that is likely to take that status by roughly mid-century, I would say that's a very significant change.
Let's stick with India for a little bit, because the result of the election, while confirming Modi as the prime minister and a majority for the coalition that his BJP leads, on the other hand, we're now back to a coalition government in India, and those in the past have been, shall we say, rather less effective. Is there a risk that we sort of are now faced with a trade-off? India would have averted sort of the risk of becoming less democratic, but now may just have a less efficient and effective government, which may hamper its economic development and its influence on the global stage.
A lot of people think exactly the way that you do. A lot of investors in particular, so in the business community, people equate a big majority with efficiency, and it makes perfect sense. You can get more done if you have a big majority. But it's not necessarily the case that that is true, particularly when it comes to big structural reforms. Modi, in his second term, when he had a very large majority in the Indian lower house and nearly a majority in the upper house, did try to push through a few structural reforms, for instance, in areas like agriculture, and found that it was impossible. The pushback was simply too great. And therefore, there is at least a theory which says that sometimes these big structural reforms are better achieved through a coalition, because then you have to do the patient but rather difficult work of building a cross-party coalition, cross-regional, cross-caste. India is such a big and diverse country that even when you're a politician with the stature of Narendra Modi and a party of the power of the BJP, it's difficult simply to rule by diktat. You have to try and build a coalition which takes the rest of the country with you. So I think the best that you can say is it's not an open and shut case that Modi having a smaller majority makes it less likely that he will be able to achieve some of these big structural reforms that a lot of people think you need to do to move the country forward in areas like labor market regulation, energy, agriculture, factor markets. So I think there's at least room for optimism, and we'll have to see.
You said at the top of the conversation, that many of these elections that we've seen throughout this year so far in Asia were not surprising. They produced the winners that everybody predicted they would produce. And the bigger and more prominent elections in Asia, largely we've seen a picture of continuity. Voters in Taiwan have voted for the same party that has been in power the last two terms. Indonesia has voted for the person who's been endorsed by the outgoing president, who has a stratospheric approval rating of like 85%. Again, India has returned Narendra Modi as prime minister for the third time. Is it fair to say that these electorates, at least in these Asian countries, are happier with the way that they're being led than Western electorates, which I think in most cases that we've seen so far this year have actually unanimously voted for change and loudly so?
That's a very complicated question. It is fair to say that there is a certain strand of democratically elected leaders in Asia that have proved recently to be much more popular than their Western equivalents. So if you look at basic polling evidence, you mentioned that Kishida-san, the Japanese prime minister, just resigned. I think he was the least popular of the the G7 leaders, but it was a pretty close run thing. For a while, you had Rishi Sunak in the United Kingdom, desperately unpopular. Chancellor Scholz in Germany, terribly unpopular. I mean, in the United States, all politicians generally seem to be very unpopular. So you have a very dissatisfied public. And then you look at Asia and you see Narendra Modi, who polls generally suggest he's pretty popular. You had Duterte and then President Marcos in the Philippines. You now have Prabowo in Indonesia. So in some of the emerging markets, leaders seem to be a bit more popular. I think you've had perhaps two contrary things happening later in this year. Firstly, sometimes those opinion polls look like they're a little bit soft. So Modi didn't do as well as expected. Prabowo has, he did well. He won a strong election victory, but subsequently there are some protests and issues about the way that his incoming administration, he's not even president yet, but the way that the outgoing administration of Jokowi and the one that he will inherit are managing the country. President Marcos of the Philippines is a little bit less popular than he was. So you see that even these popular Asian Democrats can run into difficulties. And then, as you said, then you have the fact that you're dealing with a region that is still predominantly emerging markets, and emerging markets do suffer from political instability, as we have seen in Pakistan with the aftermath of the defeat of Imran Khan, which was controversial, and then most recently with Sheikh Hasina's dramatic exit from Bangladesh. So I think it's a complicated picture, but yes, at a basic level, democratically elected leaders in Asia, with opinion polls suggest, are much, much more popular with the general public than their Western peers.
Now we have in the West incoming administrations as well. You've mentioned the new UK government. There's going to be a new US administration as well, new EU Commission. If you had to brief any of these on a very high level on some of the fundamental developments in the Indo-Pacific or the Asia-Pacific region over the last 9 to 12 months, is it possible to kind of like tease out some like broader developments that we've seen and sort of talk about, how they're relevant for these incoming administrations in the West?
I mean, I think the big thing that has happened this year is, in a sense, the dog that didn't bark, which is that we have had a relatively quiet period in terms of geopolitical competition between the United States and China. That remains overwhelmingly the most important geopolitical fault line in the region and beyond, and for a whole host of reasons to do with the US presidential election on the US side, and the Chinese economy on the Chinese side, and some very patient, very gradual diplomacy on both sides. This year has been quiet when it comes to US-China competition, particularly in an international arena that is still dominated by Russia, Ukraine, and Gaza. And we should be thankful for that. The fact that you have seen some minor tensions over Second Thomas Shoal in the Philippines, for instance, and a few other areas, but nothing like the kind of drama that you saw at the end of 2022, for instance, when Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan, or in early 2023 when you saw the balloon incident. I think the main thing that I would say is don't expect this to continue forever, as in the very minimal rapprochement between the US and China seems to me to be on a very temporary basis. And the odds are that, at least as we get through the US presidential election and into next year, that there is a reasonable risk of a return to business as usual, in which that goes back to becoming the major fault line in the world, particularly if you have the second Trump presidency. And you've seen an array of things that the US is moving through the system in an attempt to cement some of what the Biden administration team views as its achievements in the Indo-Pacific. So one example would be a recent set of agreements with Japan, which included the setting up of a new command center for the US military, which would be localized in Japan as opposed to being in Hawaii. There are a whole range of things like this, where what the US calls its allies and partners agenda in the region, where Biden and team are worried that if Trump comes in, then that Trump may unpick or undo some of these things, and therefore they try and get as much of it done as they can. So it's not just trying to get things done on US-China so that the relationship is in as good a health as it can be in the event of a Trump presidency, or even a Harris presidency, where she's a little bit more of an unknown quantity. It's also true with the US and what it's trying to do with others in the region, that they have objectives that they want to achieve in foreign policy in the last 2 or 3 months in office, and they're trying to get those through.
I want to talk about an idea that I think was sort of best framed in a column by our friend Raja Mohan in New Delhi. And he basically said that Europe is still a little bit stuck in this idea of seeing Asia as an arena or a theater. And it used to be an arena for great power competition. Maybe now it's more an arena for economic development and selling products or manufacturing things. And it kind of overlooks that Asia has become very much an actor, not just in Asia, but in Europe as well, that Asia actually plays an active role in European geopolitics, and that's somewhat of a reversal of kind of what we're used to. Can you talk a little bit about sort of how you see that influence playing out and where you would sort of expect it to increase in the future?
Raja Mohan, excellent Asia Society colleague, was making a kind of broad point, I think, about the way that in the original Cold War, there was lots of European influence in Asia, and that goes back through the colonial era, so it's something that we have been used to. Increasingly, that isn't really the case, as in there are no European countries that meaningfully affect the balance of power. What you're beginning to see is a very early stages of something different, which is that Asian countries are beginning to affect the balance of power in Europe. And so when Raja was writing about this, he was thinking specifically about Russia, Ukraine. And so the examples would be principally China and North Korea supporting Russia materially in terms of the war. You saw one of the more interesting developments this year, perhaps one of the most important, was Putin's trip to Pyongyang, and the fact that there is now something that looks very much like an alliance or a real security partnership between Russia and North Korea, but in which North Korea is providing a lot of the basic ammunitions that Russia needs to fight its war. And China also is providing, what it would describe as kind of non-military technical assistance in various different ways. So you see a strategic military influence, but in China's case, you also see an increasingly large economic influence. So if you look over the last year, then one of the big discussion points in the West, in European capitals, in Washington, in Northeast Asia, has been the effect of what people call China's overcapacity, its investment in high-tech manufacturing and exports in order to try and rebalance and restructure its own economy. And that means that China is having a big effect, or is perceived to be having a big effect on Europe's economic future through industrial policy and economic competition. And then you see, on the other side, an increasing engagement from some of the more Western allied powers. Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand attended the NATO summit, the 50th anniversary, in the summer, and are increasingly involved with NATO, albeit not in the way that perhaps Chinese critics would allege. And other countries like South Korea, for instance, are now very significant arms suppliers to countries like Poland and potentially in future also to Ukraine, although they haven't shown any signs of doing that quite yet. So I think you see a lot of evidence of what people noted in the immediate aftermath of the Ukraine conflict, which is that there's a lot of interrelation between the Indo-Pacific and the Euro-Atlantic. And this is, of course, a big tension in the future of American foreign policy, where you have a real discussion going on in Washington as to the extent to which the next American president should continue to try and focus on Europe, or whether it should really draw down its focus on Europe, let the Europeans focus on managing Russia to the best that they're able, and really focus the US's efforts on great power competition with China, the protection of Taiwan, and all that flows from that.
My sense is that this kind of US pivot to Asia is a bit of a policy that keeps getting announced, but then it's never quite getting there, right? Sometimes because the US doesn't want to, sometimes because events interfere. Obviously, if there's a war in Europe that will draw the US's attention. It seems it's a worry in Europe that the US will turn away. Is it really realistic that the US moves from being an Atlantic power to a Pacific power?
It is true that over time, the US is most likely to deliver belatedly on the promise of the pivot to Asia. And, there's a remarkable amount of agreement within the US system that China is the main challenge that it faces, the main strategic competitor. The question is how you respond to that and how quickly. But yes, I think Europeans who are worried about the fact that the US will refocus more of its energy on Asia are right to do so. The US's patience with Ukraine is limited. Even under a Democrat administration, it's not at all clear that there would be another big round of funding for Ukraine, and certainly not under Trump. So the clock is ticking on that quite quickly. On the other hand, I suppose the thing that you can say if you were an anxious European worried about abandonment is, the US has been saying that it wanted to get itself out of wars in the Middle East for the longest time and hasn't done so. And the reason it hasn't done so is it has critical strategic interests in the region, from the general balance of power to support to Israel, to to energy, to stopping Chinese encroachment. And so the same would be true in Europe. It is definitely right for Europeans to worry about this. The US is not going to be capable, given the changing balance of power around the world, to have the single position in which it is the dominant player in all theaters that it had over the last 20 or 30 years. And the logic of it spending more time thinking about the Indo-Pacific and putting more resources to there is very clear. So,
and in a way, going back to what you said before, if Europe sort of becomes more of a place where great power competition happens and where sort of Asian powers engage, whether it's militarily or economically, that would probably make it even less likely for the US to turn away, right? So then Europe is the theater that maybe Asia used to be. It's probably not a good place for Europe to be and not something to aspire to, but it's also not irrelevant.
Europe is right to be setting itself on a path in which European security is increasingly the business of Europeans, and in which the Europeans have to plug some of the big gaps, the things that they can't do militarily or economically without US help. But I also think that it's undeniable that there's only so much that Europe is going to be able to do. If the US does less because it's focusing elsewhere, then the general capacity of the European countries to manage their own security environment will be lessened without the US and all of the capabilities that it brings. So I think that creates some real long-term challenges for European security. Europe needs to step up to those challenges, and indeed it has been. It's notable, for instance, that if you look back to 2018, when President Trump had his famous NATO summit in which he read the Riot Act to his European partners, at that point, only a tiny minority of them were meeting the NATO defense budget targets. Now, most are. So there has been a change, but there's also a war going on in Europe, and the balance of power in Asia is shifting against the US, and so the US has more to do there. I think Europeans are right to be worried about this, and I think Asian powers are also, as they're growing more powerful, spending more time thinking about the role that they can play in Europe.
To pick up on what you said there at the very end, as Asian powers think a lot more and spend a lot more time and also energy and presumably money on how they want to influence on the world stage and kind of like how they want to shape the world. Is there something like an Asian approach to this? Anything resembling sort of political, if not unity, then at least convergence in Asia, where the sort of Asia as a region then can sort of make up its mind and sort of act as one, that will also then translate into obviously even bigger global power? Is that more of a pipe dream?
Yeah, I think the opposite of what you're saying is true, which is that China will occasionally talk about in its diplomacy the fact that you should have Asian solutions to Asian problems. This is a kind of language that goes back to the imperial Japanese notion of an Asian co-prosperity sphere rather. And you see it, for instance, my old friend Kishore Mahbubani in Singapore, where I lived until recently. His books do sometimes talk about the fact that when Asia is rid of the meddling Europeans and the kind of the heritage of colonialism and seizes its own destiny, the Asian century will be bright because Asians can cooperate with one another. I think it's much more likely that actually what you're seeing at the moment are increasing divisions within Asia, which is obviously a very big place. Divisions between India and China, divisions potentially between the US partners in Asia and the non-US partners, divisions with those parts of Asia which would be lumped in with the global South. What I do think is that as Asian countries become more economically powerful, ranging from the very large superpowers in the making, China and India, through to the more established rich industrial democracies like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, as their relative weight in the international system increases, then they'll want to have a greater say over how that operates, and that creates potential tensions and conflicts. So I think you'll see that as Asia becomes the center, to the extent that it hasn't already, becomes the central decision-making area of the world, the most important economic center, but also the place in which the future rules of the road are written, that will create divisions between the countries of Asia, as would be natural. Different countries will have different interests, and therefore they will have to work those out in an environment where Asia as a whole writ large doesn't have a natural way of making these kind of decisions. So no, I don't think it's very likely that you have some. Unfortunately, I mean, it would be nice if it did, but I don't think that it's very likely that there's a kind of very peaceful and balanced future. That's not to say that the rise of Asia need be as destructive and bloody for the world as the rise of Europe was, but that is obviously the risk and the historical parallel that people need to keep in mind, that when you had the rise of the European countries in the latter part of the 19th and the early 20th century, then that had an enormously destructive effect on the entire world. And Asia, as it assumes this position of leadership, needs to work very carefully to ensure that its own rise, while not entirely united, isn't destructive.
You've lived in different parts of Asia for, I think, the better part of 15 years now, and you've literally just gotten back to London. How does it feel to be back on the old continent? Do you feel you've come back to Europe and literally nothing has changed, or have there been changes that you've noticed now that you're back again here?
It's interesting to be back at this particular time because, in a strange way, Europe has become more geopolitically relevant than it has been in the last 30 years, as in the long period of peace and prosperity that you and I enjoyed in the early part of our careers after the end of the Cold War. The major events in the world were happening elsewhere. They were happening, in the Middle East, for instance. Now, Europe is a much more pronounced center of geopolitical conflict. So for those of us who are interested in that, then it is interesting to be back here. But on the other hand, you arrive back in Europe with a very clear sense that the dynamic engine of the future of the world, for the first time in 500 years, is somewhere else. This is the State of Asia podcast, and you and I listened to Adam Tooze, one of our speakers at State of Asia, the conference that you are running in Zurich in November. He made this point at a talk in Singapore that whether it's geopolitics or, for instance, an area like climate change, European countries certainly no longer have the power to shape the future of the world on their own. And maybe they don't even have the power to do that in accordance with their closest allies in bodies like the G7. And so I suppose I feel like I'm quite lucky to have spent such a long time living in and learning about Asia, because it means that I have connections and perspectives on the part of the world that will really shape the future, whether that's in geopolitical, climate, or other terms.
There's definitely a place at our State of Asia conference to continue that conversation. For now, thank you very much, James Crabtree, for having been a returning guest on the podcast, and I'll see you soon in Zurich.
Excellent. Thank you, Nico.
I'm now joined by my colleagues Remco Tanis and Manuela Coldicina to have a quick chat about the conversation I just had with James Crabtree. So that was a bit of a far-ranging conversation, starting with India, ending in Europe, a lot of stuff in between. Manuela, what were your thoughts while you listened?
The first thing that sparked my curiosity was the point that James made about coalition governments versus majority governments, and how majority governments do not necessarily have a better track record of implementing big reforms. And so I actually went and looked at this, and it's interesting because a coalition government, which at first glance might seem like may have more difficulty getting reforms through, needs to do much more of the difficult work in the beginning to align all the concerned parties, and therefore has a much higher rate of success. Then again, sort of relativizing this a little bit, a minority coalition government tends to make less promises but have a better track record of fulfilling them compared to a majority government. So I thought that was a really interesting fact, which we can sort of look at India as an example, but probably not only at India.
So basically what this means is that those coalition governments are more realistic. They make fewer promises, but then they tend to stick to those promises better. And I guess in the Indian context, that makes sense because that, new coalition government didn't actually, as far as I can tell, make too many promises, but at least the ones that it made, we can expect it to have a higher chance of sticking to. Remco, what did you pick up on?
I don't know where I read or heard this term over the past few days, but it's an interesting trend that we see all the Nepo babies in charge. We have Shinawatra, the daughter of former Prime Minister Thaksin in Thailand, that country's youngest prime minister. In Indonesia, it's not Prabowo, but thanks to the support of current President Jokowi pushing his son forward as vice president. Most experts credit that for Prabowo's big election win. And of course, Jokowi isn't done yet, also making his youngest son, Kaesong, join, what's the party called? The Indonesian Solidarity Party, and 2 days later being chosen its leader, and likely also becoming a candidate for governor of Jakarta at elections in November. Now we see in Japan where Shinjiro Koizumi is leading the LDP election trend that is due at the end of September and might become the next prime minister there. I mean, it's not a democracy, but Cambodia went from Hun Sen to Hun Manet. It's a lot of dynasties. And of course, it's not exclusive to Asia. Just look at the US, which you've also extensively discussed, where we have the Bush political dynasty. Clinton's trying to hand over from Bill to Hillary a few years back. Trump just naming pretty much his entire family and the pets into his cabinet. But if we go back to all those Asian leadership changes, I find it difficult what to make of it. It sounds bad, but a lot of them have actually just won somewhat free and fair elections. So
Might also throw the Duterte dynasty.
Yeah, of course, Duterte, Marcos.
On the list with Sara Duterte being the current vice president.
And Marcos, of course, I mean.
And Marcos, of course. I think in a way that ties to this question I asked James on sort of the relative popularity of some of those Asian leaders versus sort of Western leaders. And again, I mean, this is a very complicated field, and there are plenty of unpopular politicians across Asia, especially, as he mentioned, in Japan. But I do think there's something there, right? And I think sort of from a European and maybe especially Swiss sort of perspective, it's kind of, I think we're sometimes almost a little bit sort of offended that these less than stellar Democrats would sort of have higher approval ratings than our quote unquote real democratic politicians. And the wrong conclusion to draw from this is that these politicians are in a way better than those unpopular European or Japanese or American politicians in democracies. But I think the key here is that a lot of these countries are emerging economies. And I think what we're just seeing there with all the political instability that there is in a lot of these countries, I think a general feeling, and it's certainly true for a place like India. I think it's true for a place like Indonesia, sort of that a majority of the people feel that it's going in the right direction, right? It not necessarily feel that the politicians are perfect. They don't feel that they've arrived at the right place, but I think it's just kind of the pace of change is faster. And I think that's what ultimately matters if the electorate feels that things have broadly gotten better. And I think that's just less true for some of the established democracies and maybe for some of the emerging ones.
Following the rabbit hole of majority versus coalition governments that I fell down, I found out that apparently public perception that governments should make a difference is weaker for coalition governments or minority governments versus a single party majority government. So a stronger government somehow seems to also bring public perception feeling that the difference they should make is larger. And that does not necessarily shake out to be truth, but it seems to be in the perception.
I want to talk about the second part in a way of the conversation with James, because it kind of touches on this is a very broad argument that I've been somewhat obsessed with for the last 2 months or so, which is this idea that Asia used to be the arena for stuff, geopolitical conflict, but also maybe economic development. And now it's sort of like a little bit of a turning of a tide where Europe is becoming much more of an arena versus being an agent. And what I find interesting, and there's lots of caveats to add to this argument, we should say, but I think the general direction is there. And what I find interesting about this argument is that it's not an argument, as I think we hear very often, about European irrelevance. Right? So the interesting thing about being sort of the major arena for geopolitical conflict is that you're highly relevant. You're just not in the driver's seat. And I think in many ways that actually is the direction that Europe is heading into. And it's not Europe being irrelevant because everything moves to the Pacific and basically this continent is just a place for nice vacations and luxury watches anymore. But it's also, of course, not the place that Europe ideally would like to be. It wants to shape things, but I think it's something that we need to acknowledge is that the future will be one where Europe and European countries will be less able to push through or impose their solutions on the world than maybe they were in the past.
Just if you see initiatives for peace negotiations in the Middle East, say, or in Ukraine, come not from Washington or not from Brussels or Paris or London, but from Beijing. I still think the general tone in reaction in major European publications or from politicians is like, really? Should we take that seriously? And I can't wait for the time when maybe it really sinks in there. Yeah, really. It doesn't just come from you anymore, or it might more likely come from Beijing or Seoul or New Delhi and Washington, of course.
It occurred to me when James was making this point, but also listening to you two now, that it's perhaps less of a shift from the arena being in Asia versus the arena then moving to Europe, but perhaps both sides rising to, in some ways, more equal footing in terms of relevance. And because then for Europe, it feels like a relative loss of relevance.
I think that's a very good point. And we're sort of coming back to the topic that you brought up, Manuel, at the very beginning, which is coalitions. And I think one effect of this development that we've been discussing is that if you want to address what we would refer to as a global problem, whether that's climate change, but it could also be, sort of negotiating a peace in a conflict in the Middle East or in the Ukraine, it's much harder for the coalition that we currently sort of label as the West. It's just harder for that group of countries because of the sort of relative decline of maybe influence and power that you mentioned to do this, right? So one way to still achieve it is to obviously broaden the coalition, and that comes with the same problems as when you broaden the coalition in your government, which is you have to make compromises. It's very easy to say, and it's fiendishly hard to do. This is about compromising deeply held beliefs and values on both sides, and that's just very hard to do. It's hard to do politically, but it's also, I think, hard to do personally. And that's all for this episode of State of Asia. Grab your chance to hear directly from James, Adam Tooze, and others from the pool of our most trusted experts in Asia at the State of Asia conference taking place on November 7 in Zurich. A link to more information and how to get tickets is in the show notes. That's also where you'll find links to details on all our upcoming events and how to become a member of Asia Society Switzerland and other ways to support us. Our next episode, out in 2 weeks, features Professor Dewi Fortuna Anwar, one of Indonesia's foremost political and foreign policy experts and former advisor to the highest levels of power in Jakarta. Professor Anwar will also join us in Zurich to be a speaker at our November conference. Follow State of Asia in your favorite podcast app so you won't miss a thing. My name is Nico Lussinger. Thank you for listening.